Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of CHD's Finance Conference. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sophie Taylor. I'm Head of Finance and Procurement at Bronavon Community Housing. I'm the Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee at Valleys to Coast, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Finance Service Delivery Group. So welcome, and thank you very much to Simon, who chaired expertly yesterday. I'm taking the reins for today, so I only hope that I can live up to the precedent that you've set for us. A few practical announcements before we kick the day off. As we discussed yesterday, we're very keen to get a lot of noise going on Twitter around the conference. So there is a specific hashtag, which is FinanceConf21. So if you are on Twitter, it'd be great to see a little bit of buzz around the conference and around the sessions that are going on today. And the lovely CHD events team are working behind the scenes. So if you've got any tech problems, any issues with any of the sessions, then if you pop into the expo area, then they'll be able to help you out with that. And they're here just to keep us all on track and keep everything running smoothly. In terms of the workshops, hopefully you'll be familiar with the format now from yesterday. So they're all taking place in separate session rooms. So when you come to the workshop sessions later, you'll just need to pick the one that you want to attend. When you enter the room, if you could just make sure that your microphone's on mute to keep everything running smoothly. But if you do want to ask any questions, and I would encourage you to try and get involved in the discussions, then at that point in the session, then you can just pop yourself off mute and jump on screen as well if you like to get a bit more involved. We've got some very kind sponsors today, so we would like to thank Savills for sponsoring the coffee and chat room. So do pop into that. I know it's not quite the same when we're not all in the same room and we can't catch up face to face, but it would be really good to see a few of you in there and just have that chance for a little bit of a virtual network. And we've also got some exhibitors here. So Abovo Consult are in the expo area, and I'm told that they're offering the prize draw of a wine hamper, which by the time we finish today, you might quite fancy a little drink of wine. So it might be worth popping along to see them as well. Just so you know, all the main sessions are being recorded and they'll be available after the event. So if you do need to pop out at all or you're not able to attend one of the sessions, then you can get that on catch up and listen to those speakers back later on. Networking, I've been told I must mention networking. So so please do get involved. It's obviously it's not the same as if we were all in the same room, but it would be really, really good to see some questions coming in on the sessions and really try and kind of use the opportunity to catch up with each other and also to get as much as we can out of the speaker sessions, because there are some really good speakers lined up for today. So it would be great to see a lot of interaction from you all on the Q&A as well. So thinking back on yesterday, so we heard some reflections from Greg around what the future could hold for public services. How are we going to recover from the pandemic? And looking at how we might go forward tackling the growing climate emergency. And what was really clear from that presentation was that there's going to be a huge impact there on the finances of public sector organisations, and that we're really going to have to consider more than ever before how we ensure value for money for our tenants. We also heard from David Orr, who spoke again a lot about affordability. Some insights on how their Housing 2030 project has helped to improve the affordability of their homes. So with that general theme in mind, it seems fitting that we start our time together today hearing about what's next for the Welsh economy and what we can do to build resilience to what's coming up, really, and how we can keep an eye on what's going on out there in the world. So to start today, it gives me great pleasure to invite to the stage Sarah Dickens, who's the economics correspondent for BBC Wales. Hi, Sarah. Good to have you with us. I've got a very, very extensive and impressive biography in front of me for Sarah. So I may not read the whole thing out because we might be here for quite some time. But just to give a few headlines, Sarah is Wales's first economics correspondent and one of the country's most experienced journalists. She was the first woman industrial correspondent on television in the UK. She launched BBC Two's Working Lunch with Adrian Childs, BBC Radio Wales' first phone-in, The Sarah Dickens Show, and the business programme BBC Wales at Work. And she's won a number of prestigious awards for her work. She's also presented a wide range of programmes from Wales Today, Good Morning Wales, Women's Hour, Business Breakfast, and programmes for the World Service. So Sarah is here to talk to us today about economic black swans. So I'll hand over to you now, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, Barada, and it's great to be with you. And my gosh, you really couldn't have timed this event better, could you? Because we really don't know what kind of territory that we're going to go into now, and it is very much, I feel, the beginning of a new chapter for Wales, for us as individuals, your tenants, you as organisations. We really, we haven't known really where we've been going to a certain extent until now, but now it does feel to me like we're in a new chapter, and we really have the opportunity to start thinking about the future, but we also need to do that very carefully. When you asked me to talk about black swans, I found it really interesting to muse on black swans, if you like. As the owner of black sheep, then you can think, well, of course you'd like, the unusual one, the one that stands out. But, if you think about black swans, they're really calm, they're really unusual, but I suppose they are quite daunting. And the way that word has been used, that phrase, black swans, over the years, in other words, something that you didn't know was going to come up, a problem, a crisis that you didn't know would come up. Well, we've had quite a few of them, haven't we? So I just thought, most of us for the last 18 months or whatever have been muddling through, getting on, not sure what's going to happen next, trying to plan as much as we can, but not too far, both in our personal lives and our work lives. So I thought it might be quite useful to take a little bit of time first to sit back and have a think about the last 18 months. And really, looking back at it now, what a shock it was. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can remember exactly where I was sitting, who I was sitting with, when I watched Boris Johnson on the telly live announce that we were going into a lockdown. Now, actually, obviously, because of my work, I kind of knew it was coming. But that moment, sitting on the sofa going, oh, right, okay, right, we can go 3 miles, we can't go further, that kind of thing, I think is something that shocked us all, but we kind of got on with it. And I want to take you back to that time. And if you kind of think where you were, if it helps, but also let's think back to the economy that we had in Wales then, because it has changed so much since then. And I think is going to keep changing at that kind of rapid speed. So if we go back to the lockdown times, well, we had low unemployment, we had low interest rates, but we also had very low productivity in Wales, and we kept having that depressing news that would come out every December that once again Wales was right down the bottom, sometimes not quite as bad as Northern Ireland, other times we were the worst, right at the bottom of those GDP figures. Now, obviously, there is now a lot of discussion about whether GDP is a good measure or not, because obviously it doesn't count the things that are really important, things like, caring for your family and many other things that don't go into those stats. But at the same time, they are stats that have been used throughout my career as a way of sort of saying how healthy the economy is. So let's broadly stay with them for a moment. So we had low unemployment, great. Low interest rates, great, you could say, but also low productivity. So Wales was actually pretty fragile, let's say, as an economy before we even went into all of this. And in fact, in those days, 31% of children in Wales, as I'm sure you know, but sometimes it's quite useful to be reminded of them, were living in poverty. And I think what's perhaps even more alarming is 70% of those children living in poverty were in families where there was work. And I think that sometimes that's something that is forgotten. So we really need to remember the fragility that there was when that lockdown hit. And obviously, we had never thought of anything like that before. The notion, say 2 years ago even, that we might behave in the way that we did by April 2020. Obviously, we start, it sort of built up, didn't it? But the initial lockdown, and then, the way that we all behaved so differently. The notion of that 2 years ago would have been unthinkable. You'd think you'd never have that in the UK. Well, we have had. And, there were unusual packages put as well, weren't there? Who would have thought that the Chancellor would say, stay at home and I'll pay 80% of your wages? Who would have thought that they would have given in a lump sum a £20 uplift to universal credit? No government had done that kind of thing in the UK before. So unprecedented measures, quite frankly, because the Chancellor, the Treasury, everybody recognised that when we've had economic downturns in the past, and I've reported quite a few of them, like in the 90s and then the banking crisis in 2008, the instant reaction has been an increase in unemployment, and that unemployment can be very damaging for a long time. So to hibernate, that's what happened, didn't it? And, yes, as well as I do, that, what happened with furlough and with universal credit, and obviously there's been debate about that later on. But if we actually think about it, in Wales at its peak, there were nearly 400,000 people who were furloughed, and there were another 100,000 who had a similar package because they were self-employed. So that's 500,000 people in Wales. That's 1 in 3 working people. And that really is, something to behold and think about. And obviously that came down, and when furlough ended, there were not so many, although there were still a significant number of people who were on furlough, or rather whose jobs were on furlough. And particular sectors, of course, were particularly hard hit by that. But I think it's also really important that we recognise that for some people, 80% of their wages, especially if they weren't buying a sandwich on their way to work, weren't paying for commuting, that kind of thing, is fine. In fact, for some people, they actually saved. Whereas for others, 80% of an income where you were only just making do anyway, or if you were one of the families who are working but still living in relative poverty, then 80% of that is a problem. It's a problem the first week, but as all the weeks go on, that becomes more of a problem. So I think it's fair to say that something that we've seen is that the impact of COVID has exacerbated differences in economic opportunity, if you like, or basically in cash that people have, money people have in Wales. And, if we look at the jobs that were most furloughed, they tend to be lower paid jobs, like, for instance, in hospitality, jobs like that. They were the ones where more people were having to live on reduced incomes than others. And, if we look at some of the other figures in terms of where people were living, the kind of housing that they were living, you don't need me to remind you, but I will anyway, just so it's at the front of your brain. 48% of people in social housing were living in relative poverty as lockdown began, 41% in private rented, and only 13% in owner occupying. So, we can see that we had very different opportunities in Wales as we even began, and lockdown made that kind of more harsh. And it was, obviously we began to open up, but some of those differences kept repeating themselves. If you were an executive working from home, you were on 100% of your normal wage, probably, and you probably had cancelled that holiday, that weekend away, and things like that. So you actually had more money. Now, good for people who were building houses and doing extensions and things like that, because obviously that was more money into those economies as people began to do up their houses and make them nicer. But I think we shouldn't just forget some of the challenges, both financial and social and personal, for those people who, for a long time afterwards, continued to work from home. I met a family early on. They lived in Glynneath, and actually for the mother of the family, she had a clerical job and used to commute from Glynneath to near Swansea, and that cost her money. She had to keep that car running. And for her, when she was furloughed, actually 80% of her income was okay because she wasn't putting petrol in the car and they were living more simply. They weren't going out. But on the other hand, her husband's work in the quarry was very intermittent. And so, you could see the differences, different tensions within the house. And in many other situations, I think For some people, for instance, working in call centres who used to have long time and expensive commutes, say from the Heads of the Valleys area down towards the M4 corridor, or similarly to workplaces along the A55, then actually there were kind of economic benefits. And people also had, I think, got used to the idea of perhaps having a bit more time to go for a walk and things like that. But at the same time, massive pressures. And as you know, we need to think now, since it looks like working from home, or at least some working from home, might well be here for some time, then obviously that affects people's housing because they need the space. So again, going back to our kind of typical executive, if you like, if they've got a large house or even a shed in the garden or something like that, it could be quite pleasant. But if you were working from home with little space while also having to school the children, homeschooling, then obviously it's been a very tricky time, and a tricky time that's affected people financially, mentally, from a confidence point of view, and from their health, from many different aspects. And as we're hearing from the educational professionals, that actually the differentials in children's attainment has also been exacerbated with homeschooling. I spoke to one mother whose child was very dyslexic, and actually she didn't have work, but her partner did. And so actually she gave a lot of time to her son, which she wouldn't have been able to do before, one-to-one, and he's actually thrived in this period. So the picture I'm trying to paint is one of layers and layers of change. And in each stage, it's certainly from the experience that I've found from talking to lots of people across Wales about their personal experiences, that the differences between people's outcomes has really been exaggerated, stretched, if you like. And the Bevan Foundation a wee while ago brought out its report, which I'm sure you noticed, saying that 130,000 households in Wales had actually had to borrow money or more money and were behind with bills, and another 230,000 had borrowed more than they had before. So again, the black swan of COVID has actually exacerbated those differences that were in our economy anyway. And of course, a black swan that we knew we were coming, but we weren't sure how big it was or what it would do, is perhaps Brexit. We knew Brexit was coming. We'd had a little time to kind of prepare, but it's, you know, unraveling 40 years of trade and supply patterns is very hard to predict how that would actually happen. And so we obviously, at the same time as we were gradually opening our economy, we had those big changes, and those changes are still playing out now. So we have the mix of where the weak economy we were anyway, COVID, then Brexit as well, and that has shaken up supply patterns, as you know. It's shaken up demand, and it's really changing the way that we do things, which of course was the plan, but we didn't know about the other black swan, and that's before I even mention the Suez Canal. So we've really been through quite not quite an extremely difficult time of turmoil in terms of the economy. And I think for Wales, because we started off, well, obviously we're a smaller economy, but also a relatively fragile economy within the UK and within the world and Europe, then obviously we've been buffeted super strongly. And obviously we've had some different policies, and that's not for me to be discussing now, but you know, we were a fragile economy when we started, and we're still in that position. Although I don't want you to think, oh, Sarah's just going to be really depressed, I'm going to go and get coffee. Please don't do that, because I think despite this, in a massive shake-up as we are having, there are always opportunities. I mean, in the short term, what have we got now? We've got shortages of workers in lots of industries and lots of types of industries, from vets to HGV drivers to abattoirs, right across. And really it seems to me, the evidence seems to suggest that we'd actually had skill shortages and shortages of labour in certain areas anyway. And we'd been able to mask that, if you like, by having lots of people from other EU countries working here. And obviously, once they're not working here, then those gaps that we had in our labour market anyway have shown themselves, and they've shown themselves pretty harsh. And we've seen, as a result, wages rising in some sectors, yes, It is true what the guy who runs Acorn Recruitment told me a couple of weeks ago, that he knows of solicitors that are earning less than some HGV drivers. I must say there are solicitors in local government and HGV drivers for a big firm. But, you know, we have seen the shortage of lorry drivers push up wages. And for those individuals, obviously that's good news. But that is already pushing up prices. And the inflation level that we've got now isn't what we normally consider as high, 2.3%, but it's higher than it was. And I think we need to remember that the parts of the economy where prices are rising most are energy, food, clothing, and secondhand cars. And that's precisely the things that people actually need, the essentials. So that's going to obviously affect your tenants and your employees, and affect everybody and affect the wider society. So it's not just that prices are going up, it's which ones, if you like. And of course, the second-hand cars is because of another black swan, which is the shortage of chips, the semiconductor shortages that are meaning that the car industry as a whole is being held back. So sometimes people say to me, how come there are labour shortages when we've got unemployment? Can't we get those unemployed people to do the work that was done by people from other EU nations? And I wonder if as a society we've perhaps underestimated some of the skills of some of our workers and of some of our low-paid workers. Because I don't know about you, I certainly couldn't do a 3-point turn in an HGV with a trailer on the back. And I'm not convinced that I'd be a good care worker either. And, you know, perhaps out of this, we will reflect more on the skills needed for some jobs. And the whole reason of how we manage our labour market, how we have work for more people, and who actually can do the jobs of where the shortages are, is a sort of very complex one of layers upon layers. I do wonder, though, whether working from home will actually help some people, particularly women in some of our communities that aren't right near work, because I certainly have come across many people in Ebbw Vale, Blaen y Gwent, and in Blaenavon, all of the heads of the valleys area, where part of the thing that's kept them back from work has been the time of the commute to where work is, because they've also got caring responsibilities. So perhaps as we do get more used to the idea of working remotely, not necessarily from home, but from a hub, perhaps that is an opportunity for some people to enter the labour market who haven't before. Now, one big change, which is like not a black swan because we knew it was happening. Some people have been talking about it for more than 20 years, and perhaps we've ignored that a bit, is climate change. And so you put onto all these layers the massive changes that there are going to be and needs to be within our economy if we're going to get anywhere near net zero. That change is also layered onto all of these levels. And, you know, the Bank of England, I think it was about 2 years ago, started saying that climate change was the biggest threat to the global economy and to the UK economy. Perhaps that wasn't listened to that much by people at that time, but it certainly is now. And already big companies, financial organizations are putting into place ways of changing their business so that they can actually relate to their impact on the planet and people, as well as their bottom line. And perhaps this could be where some of the opportunities, but also some of the dangers are for people in your world, if you like. Because what's really important is that we change the way the economy runs so it's not reliant on carbon. Decarbonisation of the economy is really at the forefront of everybody's minds these days in terms of people running organisations, companies and governments. But it needs to be done, doesn't it, in a way that is just. So there's kind of a just transition from where we are now to where we need to be. And that's an important role, I think, that you can play in terms of your tenants and also your workforce. Going back to our stereotypical executive, if you like, who might have quite liked working from home, that person can go out and buy an electric car and feel quite good about it. But obviously that's not the same if you're on minimum wage or just above minimum wage. And so we need to work out a way where not only can we replace the jobs that are lost with other jobs, new jobs, and upskill people, but we also need to make sure that the other changes are accessible to people and that people aren't penalised for not having enough money to be able to live in a greener way, if you like. So where are these opportunities, Sarah? You're probably saying. You've been telling us a lot of gloom. Where are the opportunities? Well, you guys are leading the way in terms of low carbon housing. And I think, at the parts of that I've already looked at, one of the things that I found quite interesting is the localizing of the spend. So for instance, a house that is made from Welsh timber by a Welsh company with, let's say, wool insulation, things like that, that is going to keep more money in Wales, help create more jobs and keep the money in our communities. And that is obviously part of the step. And I wonder if we can learn other lessons from that in terms of the more that we localize what we do, there are various benefits on that. We're not using carbon buying in from the other parts of the world, but also we're helping to keep the money in Wales and help create jobs in Wales. And I wonder if, with these houses that are being built by yourselves and others that also generate some of their own energy, whether that will give more of an impetus to the idea of local energy generation, local networks, community-run things and things like that. Because, the days of the CEGB and the grid were built and developed in a very different time than we are now. So if we can move towards these changes, localize more, use more Welsh skill, more Welsh jobs, then that's where I personally think the opportunities lie, and to be nimble. And I'm sure you'll be talking about these kind of things much more, but not just how do we not use carbon, but how do we actually do things differently in a way that doesn't exclude people, but also creates jobs and opportunities, and importantly, better well-being and better health. And phrases like active travel are thrown around, and for some people that's easier than for others. So we need to look at each one of these new approaches that we have, whether it's electric vehicles or active travel or housing that doesn't rely on gas and oil. We need to make sure that we look at them in a way that doesn't leave some people behind. And quite frankly, Wales has got massive assets that we could use more, do we not? We have a lot of energy, we have marine energy potentially around us, we have the wind, and we have solar as well. So it'll be very interesting to see how our big industry adapts, how our big industry can decarbonize and continue to exist, because they're trying to do that, aren't they? But also to see what other opportunities come from this. So I don't want to, suggest that everything's going to be easy. It's not. We've got big changes ahead. But this is a time to perhaps recognise that our economy in Wales was pretty fragile anyway, that we had a lot of differences of life experience that have become wider with COVID. And the one thing that we do know is that we are not going back to where we were, and therefore we can help to design or try to work out what kind of design we want for a Wales of the future that perhaps can learn some of the lessons from the past. And I think yourselves, your tenants, your workers, the materials you buy, the way that you can interact in all of our lives is going to be central to that. So good luck, seize the opportunities. I'll enjoy watching how you all interact with this change, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here and talk about Black Swans.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think everyone will agree that was a really, really fascinating presentation, and really interesting to hear some of those views about what the future might hold and how we as a sector can really play such a big part in that. We're going to take a quick comfort break now. At 10:45, we've got a scheduled coffee and chat session. And then at 11 o'clock, Sarah will be joined by Jay Lacani, an economist from Barclays Bank, and Valerie Livingston, the director of News Direct. And we'll be continuing to discuss some of the themes that Sarah touched on in her presentation with those two additional speakers in a bit of a panel session. So if you have got any questions that you'd like to ask the two new panelists, then they'd be very welcome. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you all shortly.